You said it as a joke because you'd already seen the pattern forming. You spoke truth in disguise because raw truth makes people uncomfortable. They laughed, thinking it was sarcasm, thinking you were exaggerating. But you weren't guessing, you were observing. You read the trajectory, the tone, the timing, the tension. You saw exactly where their choices would lead. And now, watching it unfold, they can't process it. They're calling it coincidence, fate, bad luck, anything but consequence. You didn't curse them. You calculated them. People mock what they fear until it becomes undeniable. Now, every time they replay your words, they flinch. Because it wasn't just a prediction. It was precision. You didn't summon the outcome. You simply saw the inevitable. And what terrifies them most is that you weren't joking at all. You've learned that humor is the safest way to deliver truth in a world that rejects accountability. So you wrapped honesty in laughter, watching their reactions. Some smirked, some rolled their eyes. None of them listened. That's how people reveal their blind spots, through what they dismiss. You planted awareness in jest, because you knew they couldn't handle direct confrontation. Psychology calls it cognitive dissonance. They call it coincidence. You told them exactly what would happen when ego replaced empathy, when comfort disguised itself as control. They laughed then. Now, they're living the punchline. Their silence now is louder than their laughter ever was. They can't admit you were right because that would mean admitting they were blind. Truth delivered softly is still truth. It just ages better. You never needed to be a prophet to see it coming. People reveal their endings through their habits. You watched how they spoke to others, how they justified their shortcuts, how they twisted logic to protect pride. That was your evidence. When you mentioned it lightly, it was to test their self-awareness. But pride doesn't like mirrors. They took offense instead of reflection. Now they sit in the ruins of choices they defended with confidence. You said it half smiling, but your eyes were studying. You weren't predicting downfall. You were diagnosing inevitability. That's what intuition feels like, data disguised as instinct. And now, while they scramble to explain their misfortune, you remain calm because you already made peace with the outcome long before it happened. They thought you were mocking them when you joked. What they missed is that your humor wasn't cruel. It was clarity disguised as play. You've always known that truth disguised as laughter travels faster. People let their guard down when they think you're joking. They don't realize wisdom often hides behind wit. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were trying to wake them. But awareness offered too soon looks like arrogance to the unaware. Now that your words have materialized, they replay every sentence in disbelief. They can't laugh anymore because the punchline landed too close to home. That's the curse of denial. It always ends in irony. They didn't understand your humor was a warning. Now they understand, and it's far too late. The mind breaks when it realizes the joke wasn't random. It was revelation wrapped in rhythm. They hear it now with new ears and feel it like a haunting. You didn't mean for it to sting, but the truth always does when delayed. They called you dramatic, pessimistic, maybe even cynical. Now they call you something else, right? You didn't gloat, though. You just smiled quietly, because you've learned that vindication doesn't need celebration. You already saw how they would react if they ever realized it. They'd project, deny, deflect. Because once reality catches up, the ego panics. They can't admit your foresight, because that would mean they ignored the lesson that could have saved them. And that's the part that hurts them most. You tried to warn them, even if you did it laughing. They underestimated your observation. They thought you were detached, just making fun, too unaffected to care. What they never realized is that detachment gives you vision. When you're not emotionally tangled, you see everything. The cracks in logic, the repetition of excuses, the way people mistake momentum for progress. You could tell where it was heading, because behavior always predicts outcome. That's not mysticism, it's mathematics. You knew that the louder someone tries to appear in control, the closer they are to losing it. They laughed when you said it because illusion feels safer than truth. Now, as reality closes in, they remember that laugh like a scar. Your detachment wasn't cruelty, it was comprehension. You didn't mock them. You foresaw their collapse. You've always known that people only listen after they fall. That's why you stopped trying to convince them. You started planning truth through humor instead, because laughter disarms ego faster than logic ever could. You let them feel comfortable enough to ignore you, knowing that time would do the teaching. And it did. Life always plays back the joke in darker tones. What was once funny becomes confession. What was once dismissed becomes remembered. And when that happens, they look for someone to blame. But the mirror never lies. They'll call you manipulative, lucky, heartless, anything but perceptive. Because accepting your insight means confronting their ignorance. You don't need them to admit it. You just watch as reality repeats your words back to them louder than you ever could. The psychology of irony is cruel but fair. When people ignore truth, the subconscious doesn't forget, it waits. It collects evidence until denial collapses. That's what they're feeling now. The mental fog of regret, the heavy air of self-awareness, the realization that they laughed at the only person who wasn't lying to them. You said it lightheartedly to make it digestible, but truth has a way of expanding once planted. It grows roots in silence. You never wished harm, you just knew the cost of ignorance. They didn't take it seriously because they mistook your humor for weakness. But humor is intelligence wearing a mask. You said what others were afraid to say, and life rewarded your honesty by proving it right. You've learned that sometimes the universe delivers lessons through echoes. You were just the messenger, and now they're living the message. They can't handle it because they still associate truth with punishment instead of growth. But that's the difference between you and them. You interpret pain as information. They interpret it as attack. You understand that every realization comes with discomfort. They only understand defense. Now they're spiraling, trying to rewrite history, pretending your words were exaggerated. But the truth doesn't bend, it circles back. Every situation has come full loop, every detail you joked about now visible in daylight, and there's nothing left for them to deny. Mockery was never born from confidence. It came from trembling hands trying to look steady. Behind every smirk was a heartbeat running faster than it should, desperate to drown out the sound of truth echoing closer. Laughter became their weapon because silence exposed too much. It was safer to make the strong one look foolish than to admit they couldn't match the stillness. Words became armor, sarcasm their camouflage. Every joke they made was really a prayer, that no one would notice the cracks showing through their voice. The brave mask was their last illusion of control. Fear doesn't always look like retreat. Sometimes it looks like noise. Sometimes it looks like applause meant to distract from insecurity. They weren't laughing at the person in front of them. They were laughing to quiet the panic inside themselves. In every crowd, there's a strange pattern that repeats itself. The loudest laughter usually comes from the most fragile egos. Those who mock often do it to reclaim a sense of balance, to feel taller by pretending someone else is small. It's psychological armor. It buys time. The sound of ridicule delays the confrontation with inadequacy. The moment they mocked, their minds were whispering a quieter truth. Fear of being seen, fear of being forgotten, fear of being exposed as average. Confidence built on volume can only survive when the room agrees. The second silence enters, it collapses. Mockery was never about the target. It was always about keeping the mirror at a distance. That's why laughter feels so hollow when it comes from those who haven't faced themselves. The ridicule never carried conviction. It carried desperation. Jokes became walls because confrontation felt too dangerous. They could laugh away what they didn't understand, dismiss what they couldn't imitate, and label what they secretly envied. The mind does strange things when it meets someone unshaken. It searches for weakness and, when it can't find one, invents it. That's what mockery does, it invents comfort. It's an act of self-defense disguised as superiority. The crowd joined in not out of malice but out of relief. It's easier to laugh with the insecure than stand beside the uncomfortable. Because truth has gravity, and standing near it demands weight most don't have. When silence becomes power, insecurity becomes noise. That's the part no one admits. The one who doesn't react forces others to confront their reflection. The stillness unnerves them because it reveals chaos. The laughter they used as distraction now feels like confession. It's psychological recoil, the brain trying to escape awareness. They mocked the person who stood calm not because of arrogance, but because calmness is terrifying to the restless. It exposes lack of control. The same laughter they once used to diminish now echoes back as guilt. The joke, once a shield, now feels like evidence. What started as performance became proof of fear. People fear what doesn't need their approval. When someone moves with purpose, those addicted to validation can't comprehend it. They laugh because understanding requires surrender, and surrender feels like death to the ego. It's easier to call the disciplined cold than admit envy. Easier to mock the focused than question distraction. Every mocking voice hides the same thought. I wish I could be that still. But ego won't let it surface, so laughter fills the gap. The mocker becomes the actor, desperate to convince the audience of power they don't possess. And the more the calm one holds their ground, the louder the noise becomes. Fear doesn't vanish when ignored, it multiplies. Fear isn't always trembling. Sometimes it's theatrical. The louder someone mocks, the more they're begging the world not to notice their unease. You could see it in their eyes, that flicker of panic when their words failed to land. Mockery was never dominance, it was disguise. They tried to turn courage into comedy because facing it felt unbearable. People often try to laugh off what humbles them. They confuse amusement with safety, forgetting that truth doesn't bend for comfort. The moment laughter fades, silence returns, and silence has a way of stripping everything down to honesty. That's when the fear finally breathes through their skin. There was always a difference between humor and mockery. Humor heals, mockery hides. The former builds bridges, the latter builds walls. And those who mocked never built out of joy. They built out of survival. They needed a buffer between who they pretended to be and what they secretly feared becoming. The unbothered person in front of them was never the enemy. It was the embodiment of everything they lacked: restraint, confidence, balance. To laugh at that was to convince themselves they still had power. But power borrowed from laughter fades when no one laughs back. Eventually, mockery meets maturity, and the mask falls off. The fear it hid doesn't disappear, it just stands exposed, trembling in daylight. Every cruel laugh has a lifespan. It begins loud, dies awkward, and ends quiet. Over time, the audience drifts away, and the only one left is the performer. Alone without the echo, they finally hear what they were hiding from: the sound of their own fear, the realization that ridicule didn't erase reality, it delayed it. You can almost see it in their face when it hits. The shoulders drop, the smirk fades, the eyes dart looking for a new distraction, but there's none left. Fear, once ignored, always finds its way back. It doesn't punish, it teaches. And the lesson is always the same: what you mock, you secretly admire. Eventually they stop laughing. Not because they've changed, but because exhaustion replaces denial. The performance drains them. Keeping up the act takes more energy than facing truth ever would. When the person they mocked keeps rising, it dismantles their delusion one layer at a time. That's when silence becomes unbearable. The very thing they laughed at becomes the standard they measure themselves against. The one who was once the punchline becomes the benchmark. Mockery doesn't just fail, it backfires. It leaves the mocker obsessed, replaying what they once dismissed. Fear disguised as humor always ends in humiliation.